Chapter 13 in our text deals with the topic of education. It starts with an anecdote about a student at Yale and raises a larger issue of whether or not it's true that people who go to more elite selective institutions will be provided with more opportunities or not, or whether education at any institution of higher learning enhances dramatically the opportunities available of all who attend such institutions. One of the big questions in this particular chapter is whether or not the process of education involves learning to learn or learning to labor, which is calling into question what's the functioning of schooling. Learning to learn might harken back to a more Aristotelian thought that learning in and of itself is worthwhile, where a more pragmatic, perhaps more commonly associated with the 19th century perspective, is that learning ends up preparing people to be able to work better in the working world, not so much because of a vocational pursuit as much as because that person will be able to adapt to new situations and be able to become competent with these new types of situations. Generally, let's talk about education. Education is a process whereby certain ideas and tools, general and specific, that are academic, social, and cultural are developed. So what may not be especially clear in the educational process is that there is a kind of a functionality that's going on. Terms that are discussed early on include the idea of functional illiteracy, that people are able to get by with their reading skills, but only that, and that as much as 14% of the people in this country lack proper reading skills. A variation on that very same concept is one of innumeracy. That is, that people are able to manage with some mathematical skills to function in society, but that perhaps as many as 1/5 of those people under the age of 16 lack such skills. Finally, the concept of human capital refers to those knowledge and skills that make a person more productive and bankable, so that think of it as the kind of investment that is made into individuals that allow them to later on accomplish greater goals. Part of what is the educational process includes one involving socialization and how education can improve social interactions. The researcher Philip Jackson referred to this aspect or facet of education as its hidden curriculum, that is, the non-academic or less overt function of education. Considering this from the perspective of one of the three major theories, that is Marx's conflict theory, schools are tools of capitalism and teach skills that are conducive to maintaining positions in the workforce so that workers understand that they are subordinate, while their masters or leaders tend to be those who manage them. The skills to be subordinate included a measure of self-discipline, an ability to obey, appreciation of punctuality, and reliance or dependability. So we can also see from a Marxist perspective and more clearly how education could be a tool for domination when it turns out to be something that was used on the indigenous cultures of places like the United States and Australia to become to get these peoples better assimilated into the dominant culture. This could also be used for immigrants. The researcher Sorokin regards schools as sorting machines, ending up eliminating students who don't meet certain social requirements regarding ability, talent, social and moral character, and then sorting the remainder for future careers. So see education, therefore, as a primary tool for accomplishing a particular kind of social goal. If you accept the premise offered by Sorokin that education is a sorting mechanism, Kozel notices that black students were disproportionately being sorted into special education classes, and that those focused on teaching vocational skills. The significance of this, of course, is that it would perpetuate racial stereotypes and also limit opportunities of individuals who identify as black. Next question, do schools matter? Look at perhaps the way in which even the physical buildings say something about the impact of schools in a particular society. In 1964, you had the Coleman report, which showed that schools that were highly segregated had great achievement gaps between black and white students. It almost didn't matter the differences in resources that existed between these types of schools. What it suggests is that what accounts for differences between the so-called black and so-called white populations were family background and peers, although some suggest that this finding was suspect. Does school matter? Well, look at the impact of class size, that smaller classes generally had fewer disciplinary problems and that students in such classes attained higher score. These benefits were very long-lasting, so it suggests that an element of a better functioning educational system would be to reduce class sizes and allow for more focus. Also, look at the difference between private schools and public schools, that schools with a religious context, such as Catholic schools, generally had higher test scores, and that non-religious private schools also tended to have high scores, followed by those who attended school in a public school system. One of the consequences, unintended, that secular private schools do is to convert birthright into credentials, making them legitimate. Here's what that basically means, that people who can afford private schooling found that that meant that the individuals were able to translate that into a credential because the private schooling generally was regarded and probably was truly able to provide a better quality education. So it became a shorthand or a credential that those who attended schools would be able to demonstrate greater competencies or proficiencies. Next section, what's going on inside of schools. If Sorokin talked about a sorting mechanism, maybe the more contemporary version of sorting mechanisms is the idea of tracking. This is a way to divide students into different classes by ability or by their future clans to create a better learning environment. What this could end up doing is creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that individuals on a particular college track would end up being more likely to do well in anticipation of college, such as achieving better math scores and increasing the likelihood of graduating from high school. It does beg the larger question, does the track end up dictating the outcome, or is the outcome supported by the tracking? In general, research seems to suggest that tracking doesn't help those students who are in a general track. Those who come from a privileged background are more likely to be on a college track, and that even to the extent that you could find students who don't identify as Catholic attending Catholic schools doing very well, but that may be more of a proxy for the determination or the drive of the parents that these children engage in achieve academic success. Oakes suggested that tracking might be problematic because of the differences in the quality of teaching and content of materials between tracks. So you may find that there are less qualified teachers for the general track, as well as the materials used being of a poor quality. In talking about the classroom pressure cooker, we see the self-fulfilling prophecy occurring under the rubric or the heading of the so-called Pygmalion effect. Pygmalion is a Greek story which was updated most recently historically in the musical and movie My Fair Lady, where we see that by taking an individual and placing him or her in a higher status society, that person blooms because that person was in that higher status or society. So that in schooling, if teachers hold higher expectations for higher students, then these students respond by meeting teachers' expectations. Therefore, expect more from students and find that they rise to this. The problem is, of course, is that when you consider the development of national standards, whether or not this is going to mean that we're going to find that by creating a norm or a minimum in our society, that students won't be encouraged to do the best possible. In the context of teaching, we also see the idea of best practices. Here, best practices means teaching methodologies that have been supported or that are identified as the best kinds of teaching as supported by particular levels of research. Hauksbee ends up finding that increases in peers' reading scores were successful in raising individual students' scores. So one of the questions then is, does this work in reverse? Do people with poor scores end up dragging down individuals? Moving on to the topic of higher education, at least from the perspective of the author of our text, that higher education might be considered the equivalent of credentialism, so that higher education serves as a proxy or an alternative for demonstrating one's competency in a broad range of fields. Credentialism as being the purpose of higher education fits most closely with the theory of functionalism of the big three that we've talked about so far in the course. So what this basically means is that students responded to employer demand by attaining more education, especially within the, say, last half century or so, with the dramatic increase in the number of people who gain higher education, and ultimately that the demand for these more competent individuals is dictated by an increase in industrialization. Looking at the role of higher education from a conflict perspective, however, might end up meaning that this ends up emphasizing credentials as a proxy or as a tool for signaling social status or job qualification, so that the higher one's education, the better one's social status. In effect, it takes the meritocracy argument and sort of tips it on its head, where meritocracy is supposed to be reflective of one's competency or abilities. What a conflict perspective would suggest is that it uses it as a tool to unfairly limit individuals because of factors unrelated to the educational endeavor, that one is able to achieve higher levels of education based on the ability to command resources such as money, and it may matter far less that it is because of an individual's competency. One way of looking at higher education is to look at the idea of the SAT and whether or not this particular standardized tests that many high school students have to take reflects an opportunity for a meritocracy or creates a kind of a big test. The idea that this is a particular tool for being able to sort out individuals. Among other things, look at what has been found about the SAT, that the SAT does not predict college outcomes, even though there's a great deal of pressure to perform, and that the SAT does consistently correlate with race, ethnicity, and class, so that those who are able to afford prep courses and therefore do better on the SAT end up, in a sense, being able to achieve a higher credential, not because of competency, but because of one's social standing or financial resources. So maybe the SAT's predictive power has more to do with the correlation between the test and family background, so that with a better family background, individuals are going to be inclined to do better. Consider also the idea of affirmative action in higher education. There is a difference between myths and reality about what goes on here. Affirmative action is to attempt to redress historical discrimination, the effects of historical patterns of discrimination against certain segments of our society. This Potentially preferential treatment, however, applies only to qualified individuals, so that it's a type of preferential treatment that attempts to allow for a leveling of the playing field. Some of the myths that are identified in this particular chapter relating to affirmative action includes the fact that it is the only form of preferential treatment for living in a rural community or in unusual life circumstances, which isn't necessarily the case. Also, that affirmative action is a zero-sum activity, that it ends up taking away opportunities from some individuals, presuming that there's only a finite amount of opportunity, where in fact that may not be the case. Further, that those who end up gaining the advantages or the benefits of affirmative action are underprepared and will actually founder in a competitive environment. Work a variation on the theme of the SAT and of affirmative action is of the question of intelligence and of the IQ test. Understand that IQ, or the intelligence quotient, doesn't actually necessarily measure intelligence as if it were a discrete facet of a person, but rather looks at ability to perform a certain kind of standardized test within a context. It may not, in fact, measure innate intelligence, merely one's competency to take those kinds of classes. Also, consider as a broad topic the issue of inequalities in schooling. Why do such inequalities arise? Well, for example, we'll see inequalities in terms of social class or socioeconomic status, which is often referred to as SES, and is made up of things like parents' educational attainment, parental occupational status, family income, and family wealth. That ultimately, the more that we see people succeeding on these indicia has to do with the success of their particular parents. Look at it in terms of inequalities in terms of cultural capital, a term coined by Bordeaux, which relates to the cultural resources that people inherit and use to their advantage. These include things like interactions with schools, where parents may feel like equals with teachers given their respective backgrounds. Think of it this way, as objectified capital regarding the significant investment of time and money to acquire it. Institutionalized capital is legitimized through a formal system such as education that is acquired, and that embodied capital is innate to a person, something that is useful when trying to challenge whether or not teachers should be doing a particular kind of way. It ends up, in effect, rewarding those from a middle-class background because of the knowledge that they've acquired outside of the classroom, or that they may have acquired from home life. Other inequalities in schooling include the concept of race, and as we've seen in prior chapters, race is a social construct, that there is not something necessarily innate to it, but that it is a means of, that it has a certain value to a particular culture. Generally speaking, we see that people who identify as black do more poorly on cognitive achievement tests and experience higher rates of being left back or suspended or expelled, which begs the larger question, why is that happening? For people who think as race is something as fixed and immutable, this ends up serving to validate the perception that one's race dictates one's particular social standing. Perhaps what's going on here has less to do with the idea of so-called race, that this is explained by class more than race, and that the advantages that class confers upon individuals is more pronounced. This ends up, of course, bringing up the topic of stereotype, in particular when individuals are negatively stereotyped and placed in a situation where they may confirm these stereotypes by those who are doing the stereotyping. This kind of stereotypic threat indicated that we see that people respond according to what they expect of a particular type of social movement or circumstance. Finally, even though race has not been established as a conclusive single unique character or attribute, we still see something like the gene movement, which talks about masses having about certain individuals or groups of individuals underachieving, even though there has been a large amount of evidence to the contrary. Contrast the issue of race with that of ethnicity, that we end up finding that people who identify as Latino end up scoring poorly on the SATs, that they have a higher rate of repeating grades and are suspended or expelled at a higher rate than those who would identify as white, that we end up having people of an Asian ethnicity doing higher than so-called white students, but that plays into still a newer concern of the so-called model minority stereotype, that these people would be innately better able to do certain types of tasks. A new impending crisis could also relate to gender, where it seems like we're seeing girls surpass the competency of boys in many particular areas, where although the last bastion of boy supremacy, to the extent that you would expect that the terms boy and girl are discrete and are consistent in their applications, that girls don't do so well with the so-called STEM topics: science, technology, engineering, and math. And finally, that even within family members, you don't expect to see that there is consistency. You might find that it has to do with the order of birth amongst the children and the amount of spacing between the children, that this may be accounted for by the so-called resource dilution model, which suggests that parenting resources are finite and that each additional child dilutes them, so that generally those who are later in time and further back in time will have fewer resources and therefore not do as well as the earlier ones. To close, consider the topic of vouchers and public policy regarding vouchers. Vouchers are coupons administered by the government that may be redeemed at any type of school, public or private. And what that ends up meaning is that we give people more choices on where they want to go for schooling. So far, at least according to the sources mentioned in this particular text, that the test scores of students who use vouchers didn't differ from those of other children. So it begs the question of whether or not the fact or the possibility of having social choice necessarily means that students will end up doing better. And that's all that I've got to say for Chapter 13.